Sometimes, life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. One ordinary afternoon, a kind-hearted young woman, going about her usual routine, notices an elderly lady struggling to carry her groceries. Without hesitation, she steps in to help, offering a warm smile and her steady hands. What she doesn't know is that this small act of kindness is about to change her life in ways she could never have imagined. The elderly woman, dressed simply yet exuding a quiet grace, seems grateful and unassuming. They share a heartfelt conversation, and the young woman offers to accompany her home. What starts as a simple gesture of goodwill leads to an unexpected bond. But what the young woman doesn't realize is that the woman she's helping is no ordinary person. She's a powerful tycoon, wealthy, influential, and known for her sharp instincts in both business and life. As their connection deepens, the elderly woman begins to see something extraordinary in the young woman. Her genuine heart, unwavering humility, and strength of character leave a lasting impression. Soon, the tycoon starts to form a secret plan, one that involves her executive son, a man with a guarded heart and a life consumed by work. What unfolds next is a tale of hidden identities, unexpected alliances, and a daring plan that will challenge the boundaries of fate. But will the young woman discover who the elderly lady truly is? And how will she react when she learns that her simple act of kindness might lead to something far beyond her imagination? Stay tuned to find out how this heartwarming story unfolds, because sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can spark the most extraordinary journeys. The young woman couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unique about the elderly lady she had helped. Despite her modest appearance, the older woman's calm confidence and sharp wit hinted at a story far more complex than she let on. Over the following weeks, their bond grew stronger. The elderly woman, who introduced herself simply as Mrs. Gray, insisted on inviting the young woman for tea at her grand yet understated home. The house was an architectural masterpiece, blending old-world charm with subtle touches of luxury. It felt out of place for someone who appeared to live such a modest life. During their conversations, Mrs. Gray seemed endlessly curious about the young woman's life, her dreams, struggles, and values. The young woman shared openly, speaking of her ambitions and the challenges of making ends meet. She mentioned how her parents had instilled in her the importance of kindness and helping others, even when it wasn't easy. Mrs. Gray listened intently, her sharp eyes glinting with interest. Unbeknownst to the young woman, Mrs. Gray was quietly testing her. As one of the wealthiest and most influential business figures in the city, she had long grown tired of insincerity and shallow connections. Yet, in this humble, kind-hearted stranger, she saw something she hadn't seen in years: genuine integrity. Meanwhile, Mrs. Gray's son, a brilliant but emotionally distant executive, remained unaware of his mother's growing friendship. He was a man of calculated precision, dedicated to expanding the family empire. Having experienced betrayal in the past, he had built high walls around his heart, focusing solely on his career. Mrs. Gray worried that he had lost touch with what truly mattered, and she was determined to change that. One evening, as the young woman sat in Mrs. Gray's lavish parlor, sipping tea and marveling at the intricacies of the artwork on the walls, Mrs. Gray brought up a surprising topic. "My son would like you," she said with a sly smile. The young woman nearly choked on her tea. "Your son?" she repeated, laughing nervously. "Why would someone like him be interested in someone like me?" Mrs. Gray's eyes twinkled mischievously. "You might be surprised. He needs someone like you, someone who can remind him of what's important in life. Perhaps you could meet him someday." The young woman brushed off the comment, thinking it was just a kind but far-fetched compliment. She had no idea that Mrs. Gray had already set her plan in motion. Elsewhere, Mrs. Gray's son was buried in work, unaware of his mother's scheme. But fate intervened when Mrs. Gray asked her son to accompany her to a charity event, where she conveniently arranged for the young woman to volunteer. The meeting was anything but smooth. The young woman, nervous and out of her element, accidentally spilled a drink on the impeccably dressed executive. He reacted with icy irritation, and she felt humiliated. Mrs. Gray, however, couldn't have been more delighted. She knew her son's arrogance needed to be challenged, and this spirited young woman was just the person to do it. Despite the rocky first impression, circumstances kept pulling them together. Mrs. Gray orchestrated subtle opportunities for them to interact, from casual dinners to business-related events where the young woman's fresh perspective offered unexpected insights. Slowly, the tension between them began to shift. The executive, used to a world of transactions and hidden agendas, found himself intrigued by the young woman's authenticity. She, in turn, saw glimpses of vulnerability beneath his polished exterior, though his guarded nature often frustrated her. Meanwhile, conflict brewed behind the scenes. Not everyone in Mrs. Gray's circle approved of her growing bond with the young woman. Some of her business associates and extended family questioned her intentions, viewing the young woman as an outsider who didn't belong in their world. Whispers of ulterior motives began to spread, adding pressure to the already delicate situation. At the same time, the young woman faced struggles of her own. She felt torn between her growing feelings for Mrs. Gray's son and the harsh reality of their vastly different lives. She worried about being judged, about not being enough. Her insecurities deepened when she overheard a heated argument between Mrs. Gray and her son. "You can't just meddle in my life like this," he snapped. "She doesn't belong in our world. You're setting her up for heartbreak." Mrs. Gray's response was calm but firm. "You're wrong. She belongs wherever she chooses to be, and she has more integrity in her little finger than most people have in their entire lives. If you can't see that, the loss will be yours, not hers." The young woman didn't stick around to hear the rest. Her heart sank, and doubts began to consume her. She contemplated walking away from the entire situation, believing it was too complicated, too painful. But Mrs. Gray wasn't about to let her give up so easily. She reached out, sharing pieces of her own story, her struggles as a young woman, the sacrifices she'd made, and the importance of following one's heart, no matter how daunting the path. As the young woman wrestled with her fears, Mrs. Gray's son found himself grappling with his own emotions. He couldn't deny the growing connection he felt, but his past scars and fear of vulnerability held him back. He began to realize that his mother's meddling wasn't about control. It was about giving him a chance at something real. The tension reached its peak during a grand gala hosted by Mrs. Gray, where both the young woman and her son were present. Sparks flew, not the romantic kind, but the kind fueled by misunderstandings, unspoken feelings, and simmering frustration. Words were exchanged, emotions ran high, and just when it seemed everything was about to fall apart, a sudden, unexpected crisis forced them to confront their true feelings. But would they have the courage to overcome their fears and seize the chance at happiness? Or would the weight of their differences and the judgments of others tear them apart? The answers remained elusive, leaving the audience on the edge of their seats, eager to see what fate had in store. As the gala unfolded, the tension was palpable. The young woman standing near the grand staircase could feel her heart pounding in her chest. The elegant chandeliers above cast a golden glow over the ballroom, but the beauty of the evening seemed far away. All she could think about was how her world had suddenly become so complicated. The crisp scent of expensive perfume, the soft hum of distant conversations, it all felt like a distant echo. She felt alone, her mind racing with thoughts of what had just transpired between her and Mrs. Gray's son. The sharp words they'd exchanged echoed in her mind, and doubts clouded her thoughts. But then, as if by fate, she felt a presence behind her. She turned to find Mrs. Gray standing there, her eyes filled with a calm determination. "Don't let this moment define you," Mrs. Gray said softly, her voice steady. "You're stronger than you think. And sometimes, the hardest things are the ones worth fighting for." The young woman felt her throat tighten. She wanted to cry, to let all the frustration and uncertainty out, but she held it in. Mrs. Gray's words had an effect on her. Something deep inside urged her not to give up. She had worked too hard, cared too deeply, to just walk away now. Meanwhile, across the ballroom, Mrs. Gray's son stood at the far end, his posture tense. His eyes searched the crowd, though his thoughts seemed miles away. He had been in the middle of a conversation when he excused himself abruptly, unable to focus. His mind kept drifting back to the young woman, to the way she had looked at him moments ago, hurt and confused. He regretted every word he'd said, and the walls he'd built around his heart began to feel more like a prison than a fortress. He had always been afraid of getting close to anyone. His upbringing, his success, none of it had prepared him for the depth of connection he now felt. But as he watched her stand by the window, her silhouette framed by the moonlight, something inside him shifted. He couldn't keep pretending to be indifferent. He couldn't keep running from something so real. With a deep breath, he made his way toward her, each step heavier than the last. He had no plan, no rehearsed lines, just a desire to make things right. "Wait," he called out, his voice low, barely rising above the music. The young woman turned at the sound of his voice, her expression a mixture of confusion and wariness. He stopped a few feet away, unsure of how to begin. "I'm sorry," he said, his tone quieter now. "For everything I said. I didn't mean it." The young woman didn't speak at first. She studied him, the pain in her eyes softened by a flicker of understanding. "I don't know what you want from me," she replied, her voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "I want—" He paused, struggling to find the right words. "I want to be honest with you. I've been pushing people away for so long, and I didn't know how to deal with this with us." He looked down, his hand running through his hair, his vulnerability palpable. "I never thought I'd feel this way about anyone. But it's happening, and I don't want to lose it." Her heart fluttered in her chest. She had expected more excuses, more cold indifference. But here he was, standing before her, admitting his fear, his mistakes. It was raw, real, and unlike anything she had imagined. "I'm scared too," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "Scared that I'm not enough. Scared that all of this, the world we live in, the people we're surrounded by, it's too different. I don't belong here." He shook his head, taking a step closer. "You belong wherever you want to be. I've seen you and I know who you really are. I don't care about anything else." For a moment, time seemed to stand still between them. The world outside the ballroom faded away. All that mattered was the quiet sincerity in his eyes and the unspoken connection they shared. Slowly, he reached out, his hand hovering near hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, she took a breath, steeling herself against the uncertainty that still lingered. "I've never been this scared," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "But I'm willing to try if you are." And with that, the barriers between them began to crumble, piece by piece. Elsewhere, Mrs. Gray stood at the edge of the ballroom, her heart swelling with a quiet pride. She had known all along that her son needed to face his fears, needed someone who would challenge him in ways that no one else could. She had seen it in the young woman from the moment they met. Her kindness, her strength, her ability to break through walls that others couldn't. She had seen it in the way they interacted, the way they fought to connect despite the odds. But even she hadn't known what would come next. She had hoped for reconciliation, for understanding, But watching them together now, she felt a sense of peace. This was the beginning of something new, something real. In the weeks that followed, things slowly began to shift. The young woman found herself more involved in the world she had once felt so distant from. She and Mrs. Gray's son continued to grow closer, their bond strengthening with each passing day. They faced challenges together, navigating the complexities of their different lives, but they did so with newfound understanding and trust. Mrs. Gray, ever the mastermind, had orchestrated more than just a matchmaking scheme. She had brought two people together who needed each other in ways they hadn't yet realized. But as time passed, it became clear that the young woman was no longer just a pawn in Mrs. Gray's plan. She had become someone who could stand on her own, who could carve her own path, no matter what the future held. And for Mrs. Gray's son, the transformation was equally profound. He began to open up, to share pieces of himself he had long hidden. His work, once his sole focus, now seemed secondary to the deeper connections he was forming with her, with his mother, and with himself. He learned that love wasn't something to fear, but something to embrace. That vulnerability wasn't a weakness, but a strength. As for Mrs. Gray, she had orchestrated many successes in her life: business deals, acquisitions, and power plays, but nothing had ever given her the sense of fulfillment that watching her son and the young woman together brought her. She saw in them a future not bound by wealth or status, but by the simple, profound connections that make life worth living. In the end, it wasn't money, status, or even grand gestures that defined their journey. It was the quiet moments of understanding, the willingness to let go of fear, and the courage to trust one another despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead. The young woman, once unsure of where she fit in this world, had found a place for herself, not in the shadow of someone else's expectations, but in the light of her own courage and authenticity. And as she stood beside Mrs. Gray's son, hand in hand, she knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together. And so, their story continued not with a perfect ending, but with the promise of a new beginning. A beginning shaped not by the wealth or titles they held, but by the strength of their connection, the depth of their love, and the courage to build something lasting, something real, the kind of love that doesn't just survive, it thrives.